Hello, everyone, and welcome to Kilowatt, a podcast about electric vehicles, renewable energy, autonomous driving, and much, much more. My name is Bodhi, and I am your host. And on today's episode, I sat down with Vasile Nubey of Earthworks and Glenn Hurowitz of Mighty Earth. If you're not familiar with these two organizations, Earthworks is a nonprofit that's dedicated to protecting communities and the environment from the adverse impacts of mineral and energy development while promoting sustainable solutions. So just to sum that up, they go in and make sure that these mining operations and drilling operations are doing right by the communities and the environment that they're operating in. I think we can all agree that if somebody wanted to come in and drop a bunch of oil derricks in the area that we're living, we would want to make sure that we had a say in what they were up to. And we would want to make sure that if this actually went through, that it's not going to poison our water or, foul our crops or any of that kind of stuff. So it's really important what Earthworks is doing. And then along the same lines, we have Mighty Earth, and they're a global advocacy group that's focused on protecting nature and the environment. All right, now that we know who everybody is and what their organizations are about, let's talk about what we're actually going to discuss in this interview, and that is Lead the Charge. Lead the Charge is made up of a diverse group of organizations they're all working towards transforming auto supply chains to make them more equitable, sustainable, and, with any luck, fossil free. That's the overall goal. And what Lead the Charge does is they create this leaderboard, which evaluates 18 of the world's leading automakers on their efforts, like I said, to eliminate emissions, environmental harms, and human rights violations from their supply chain. So each automaker receives a percentage score reflecting, the proximity to the leaderboard's expectations of what the leaderboard is saying is truly a clean car. And again, these metrics are based on fossil-free, environmentally sustainable supply chains, coupled with human rights and responsible sourcing. And on their website, which you can find at leadthecharge.org, they have the whole report. And the report is 88 pages long, but it is very well done. And I found it to be formatted in a way that was easy for me to read and the information that they were trying to get across. So I would highly recommend going to their website and checking it out. But if you want to just go to their website and look at the leaderboard, you can do that as well. And we're going to get to the interview in just a second. I just want to go over one more thing. I'm just going to highlight the top performers in 2025 on the leaderboard. So Tesla achieved a total score of 43% overall score on the leaderboard, which put them at number one. And I believe, if I'm remembering this right, they jumped up from number 3 to number 1 this year. Number 3 in 2024, number 1 in 2025. And then Ford is close behind Tesla. I believe they were number 1 last year. I'll have to check on that. But they got a total score of 42%, and they excelled in human rights initiatives with a score of 52%. And then Mercedes comes in at number 3 with 41%, and they demonstrated a balanced performance across all of their main categories. Again, the overall score of 43% or 42% or whatever these companies got is measured against what the groups in the leaderboard are measured against what the Lead the Charge folks set as a truly clean car. And if you want to check out last year's episode, which I thought was a really good episode, I was very proud of it, I'll put a link in the show notes as well. All right, that is enough of me yakking. Let's go ahead and welcome Vasile Nubey and Glenn Hurowitz to the show. I'm just going to start off by asking you both to introduce yourself and talking about your organizations and kind of what you do within those organizations. So Vasile, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Bodhi, and very appreciative to be on your platform and to speak with your listeners. So I'm from an organization called Earthworks. Earthworks has over 30 years experience supporting communities on the front line of mining, oil and gas extraction in the US and around the world. I'm specifically the lead corporate campaigner for our Making Clean Energy Clean, Just and Equitable initiative. And the aim of our initiative is to ensure that in as much as we have a just transition and we need to have a just transition, we also use this as an opportunity moment to make sure that our transition to a low carbon economy doesn't replicate the mistakes of the dirty fossil fuel energy, and that we actually ensure that the rights of Indigenous peoples and frontline communities are upheld.
Perfect. And Glenn, how about you?
Yeah, I'm the founder and CEO of Mighty Earth, which is an advocacy organization working to protect nature and climate. We tackle the big issues that don't get enough attention within those. So things like protecting tropical rainforests and other ecosystems around the world, rewilding ecosystems, and relevant to, I think, what we're talking about today, driving decarbonization, especially industrial decarbonization, things like steel, aluminum, batteries, which are the source of a quarter of global climate pollution, but until relatively recently have gotten very little attention, despite their big impact on the atmosphere.
And then, and either one of you can take this, but Lead the Charge was on last year. It's it's made up of a lot of different groups. Can somebody just kind of summarize for those who didn't listen to last year's podcast what Lead the Charge is and what they do?
Yes, so Lead the Charge is made up of a range of multi-issue, multi-region civil society organizations all over the world. And our aim is to come together and assess 18 of the world's largest automakers to see the extent to which they're moving towards having an equitable, sustainable, and 100% fossil-free supply chain. So every year we evaluate automakers' commitments to policies, their progress, and their actions on their supply chains. And we do this in terms of indicators on a fossil-free and environmentally sustainable supply chain, and also related to their environmental and climate.
Based on, if we're comparing 23 and 24 to against each other, what are some of the biggest shifts or developments that you saw, both good and bad? Because obviously, in 2023, no automaker got an overall score above 50%, and in 2024, no automaker got an overall score of above 50%. So, what are some of those shifts that you saw for the positive, and some of those shifts that weren't so good?
Yes, I can jump in, Glenn. I would say some of the largest results that we've seen is that some of the biggest performance improvements were in the general climate and human rights subsections. So we saw 8 percentage points increase in that section, and we saw a 5 percentage point increase in responsible transition minerals. I think overall, you are correct in saying that the difference between last year and this year's iteration isn't that much when we look at which automakers were able to get beyond 50%. In both years, there were none. I also think similar to last year, this year we saw Indigenous people's rights also getting poor results.
Okay. And then when it comes to just kind of the leaderboard, when I'm looking at the total scores here, it looks like Tesla jumped up to number one, whereas Ford dropped down to number two, and then Mercedes dropped down to number three. So, there's a little bit of jostling. How much of that is, how do I say this? Like, are these big shifts? Did it take Tesla a lot to jump up in the overall by 2 spots, or was that minimal effort on their part?
So, if I could jump in here, I think the more significant differences are between the top 3 and the bottom 10, maybe, and that's probably where you see the biggest differences in terms of their impact on the climate and human rights, etc. So, Tesla shares information about its the impact of its supply chain emissions in a way that other companies have not yet, but we're encouraging them to do so. And then, they also have done things like moved away from leather towards just a synthetic substance that feels good and doesn't have the risk of deforestation. I think also one of the things that it's really important to stress in this overall scorecard is the percentage of sales that are EVs to start with, because the benefits of moving from an internal combustion engine to an EV for the climate are in and of themselves enormous. You're typically looking at least 2/3 benefit, if not more, depending on the energy mix that goes into the electricity portfolio. So obviously, as a 100% clean energy company, that's great, and that gives them a bit of an edge there. Interestingly, at the flip side, you see some of these Chinese EV makers, which perform very poorly on the metrics that we've established here in terms of, where are their materials coming from? Are they produced using coal? Are they involved in egregious human rights abuse? Are they at all transparent about how they're doing business? And for the most part, the Chinese companies perform very poorly on that, even as they're selling hundreds of thousands or millions of electric vehicles. And that's a mix and a paradox. And I think one of the reasons that this campaign exists is to bring attention to the impact of the materials that go into cars, because this is one of the big opportunities for driving climate action. As I mentioned earlier, we focused on this issue because looking at, what is causing climate pollution? It's absolutely emissions from gas-powered vehicles. It's coal and oil, deforestation, destroying rainforests and sending the smoke from that up into the atmosphere. All of those things, yes. But it's also the materials that go into industrial products like cars, like steel, aluminum, batteries. 2/3 of global climate emissions come from these heavy industrial products. And the auto industry has a major potential to drive change with them through their supply chain leverage. They are really valued customers. And that's why we focus so much on the auto industry, because they buy high value steel and aluminum. They're generally reliable customers. And so, yeah, it's a good thing to move to an electric vehicle, period. But if the coal is coming from, if the steel is coming from a source that is not shifting towards green, clean energy steel, or in the case of Hyundai, which we recently focused on, using coal from Russia, that's something that we think they should change, address, and do due diligence around, because people want to know that like the cars that they are driving, even if they're electric and have a major climate benefit for doing that, and I can't emphasize that enough, that they also want to know that it's like not made with Russian coal that's financing the invasion of Ukraine, that it's hopefully made using clean energy. And this is really important as we move towards a world where ultimately, you're going to see much higher EV uptake. And we anticipate that by 2040, 60% of the environmental impact of a car won't come from tailpipe emissions, but actually from the materials that go into manufacturing it.
So correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think like I was listening back to the episode last year, and it's like the auto industry uses the most aluminum out of any industry, if I remember that right. And then they don't use the most amount of steel, but they use like the most amount of high quality steel. So when that's being processed, it's better to process that with green hydrogen, which is broken from water and not broken from natural gas. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? And I would imagine that there's a cost to that as well. The Chinese auto manufacturers have a ridiculously low price point for a variety of different reasons. One of those reasons, if you know what you're saying here, is that they're using dirty steel. Then it makes sense that a company like a company that's using the green steel may have to pay a little bit more for that steel than a company that's using the steel that's processed with coal.
Right. That's absolutely correct. And that's our whole theory of change. You've summarized it, that, the auto industry with steel, for instance, it buys these high value types of steel. They tend to be relatively reliable customers. And so that gives them a lot of leverage to move steel companies. The steel companies care a lot about them as customers. And so if they are asking for low carbon steel, they're more likely to invest in it. And we've seen that happen already. We've seen major steel companies commit to science-based decarbonization, in part moved by GM, Tesla, Ford, saying, we want at least 10% of our steel to be green by such and such a date. And that creates a market incentive for steel companies to make, some of the major investments. The thing is, this is not going to happen overnight. Like, transforming the steel industry is a multi-decade challenge. And what we're trying to do is create an incentive by working with the auto companies for them to start those investments. Moving to green hydrogen requires investment. We hope governments could contribute to that as well. But this is mainly a job for the private sector that actually produces these materials. And that is what we are trying to spark, and we've already seen some results. So, in part spurred by auto industry demand, you have seen green steel production go from the laboratory scale to a pilot scale to actually now you have factories producing this stuff and being sold. We need to scale this up 100x or more, but it is, as the scale has expanded, the cost of green steel comes down a lot. I think with the Chinese auto companies, yes, in part, China uses a hell of a lot of coal, and that's one of the reasons that they're don't score that well, even if they have relatively high EV percentage sales. And that's something that they need to address. And we hope that, for the Chinese companies that see the United States and Europe as their emerging markets, which is maybe a flip of how we traditionally think about things, people here to a significant extent care about the climate impact of these cars, and they are going to want that. And so we hope that as they look to expand their markets, this kind of campaign and what they're hearing about from the auto industry drives them to change. I also would say that, perhaps unsurprisingly, one of the issues with the Chinese companies relative to the other international European, American, Asian companies is that they're not as transparent about most of these issues. So it's been incredibly hard to get information from them about where their steel, aluminum, batteries, leather, rubber comes from. And that's something that we're trying to work with them on and say, like, if you really want to be the market leader around the world, if you really want to build on the growth that you've had in the European market, you're going to have to share this information. And so that's one of the things that we're asking them, and hope consumers would ask them too.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about the processing, and Vasily, what about the extraction of these not only the metals, but the minerals that we need for batteries and things like that?
Yes, I mean, just adding on to what Dan has mentioned, autos are the number one consumer of these battery minerals, and they are the dominant driver of transition minerals. Sometimes they refer to as battery minerals or critical minerals. And so, similar to what Dan described in terms of how automakers can be drivers of change when it comes to steel, we also view automakers as being drivers of change in how battery minerals are mined and the impacts of those mines on communities. So there's a statistic about how the world, 54% of the world's transition minerals are on or near indigenous people's lands. And so how those transition minerals are mined, whether there is a decision to mine or not mine, relative to indigenous people's rights, I think is a big question. And so we see automakers as being able to lift all boats up, specifically when it comes to the mining industry. I think many of your listeners will know that the mining industry has a history of displacing communities where the minerals are, of polluting waters, of resulting in environmental degradation. And so we really see automakers who meet these transition minerals as playing a key role in holding the mining companies in their supply chain to this high standard of ensuring that when the minerals are mined, there is responsible source of use. Similar to what Glenn said, we do need to have a transition. We do need to have more electric vehicles or public transportation out there, just so that we can move away from the internal combustion engine. But how we do this is important, and we see automakers playing a key role.
Vasily, what are some of the ways that, if you want to just give me like 2 or 3 ways that automakers could ensure this, or even the miners themselves, what are some things that they could do to, one, have a limited environmental impact, or as limited as possible, obviously you're digging into the ground, and 2, not, upset the or displace the indigenous people, or, basically force them to work for very low wages? What are some of the things that they can do?
Yes, I mean, I think the first step that we assess all automakers on is on their level of commitment. So I think, unfortunately, we are still seeing a trend where automakers don't have express and clear commitments to Indigenous peoples or related to Indigenous peoples' rights. For example, in this year's leaderboard, Ford is one of only 2 automakers that expressly states that it respects the rights of Indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent. And so what we need from all the other automakers is to also make those express commitments related to ethics And what that does is it enables automakers to then trickle down those commitments to the rest of their supply chain and to cascade it down to their supply chains. So when suppliers are wanting to engage with the automakers, they understand that the way that they mine their minerals needs to be in full respect of indigenous people's rights. Another thing that automakers could do, and some of this language is in the statement that was released by Securing Indigenous Rights in the Green Economy Coalition. They reacted to the leaderboard results. And one of the things they also recommend is implementing robust due diligence processes. So what we're seeing with transition minerals or battery minerals, there's a lack of transparency. And so with a lack of transparency about where these transition minerals are being mined, it becomes harder for automakers to actually ensure that they are doing their due diligence and that they are able to make sure that where they are being mined, there is the mitigation of environmental degradation or water pollution. So, yeah, I think those are key. Making the commitment, having transparency regarding your supply chain, and then also ensuring that you do due diligence. So where your minerals are being mined.
And so transparency has come up a couple times when you both have been talking. What are some of the ways? Because lead the charge can't twist anybody's arm to be more transparent. So I'm guessing there's got to be like a carrot and a stick to this, right? If BYD, for instance, cares how they rank on this list, which I think where are they? 16 out of 18. The carrot would to improve some of the things that you were talking about in terms of using clean steel, that kind of stuff. How do we? I don't know how to do this. How do we make the automakers more transparent? Like ultimately, you would want to do this without some sort of active government. So how do we work with them? What's the carrot and what's the stick?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say, look, it would be great to have government require basic transparency in the same way that they, ask companies to share their fuel efficiency performance, some of the basics about the overall climate impact, where the materials come from. These are things consumers want to know. And there have been moves in some countries to do that, not as much momentum towards it in the United States at present. However, I think you're right. We don't need the government to necessarily do this if companies are willing to share this information themselves. They get, because they are in touch with their consumers, they're studying their consumers, that people want to know, especially when you're making a big purchase like a car, that they are comfortable with how it's made. And a lot of, for EV purchasers in particular, I think some people are concerned about the climate impact. They obviously want great performance too. But it's one of the benefits of driving an EV is you can feel a little better about yourself as you're going to work or picking up your kids. And across the board, across industries, we've found that whether it comes to transparency or actually just changing the way sourcing happens, the companies are receptive, sometimes under a bit of pressure. I'll give you an example of that with an Asian auto company, Hyundai. So they're based in Korea, but one of their biggest markets is the United States. And we brought some pressure on them around the fact that one of their aluminum suppliers was notoriously involved in really egregious human rights abuses, land grabbing, and was using massive amounts of coal. And we worked with this organization of K-pop, the Korean pop stars, bringing attention to this and how they thought this iconic Korean company could do better. We went to the LA Auto Show and raised attention to it there. And in response, Hyundai actually, to its credit, stopped doing business with this particularly notorious company. So they showed responsiveness. We've seen Ford, GM, many others that are reflected in this scorecard not always be perfect, but improve in response to consumer demand to do so. And I think, there is this trend that people want to know about the products that they're buying, and they get that. And I think that's the fundamental driving force. And organizations like Earthworks, like Mighty Earth, and other allies, are maybe the pointy end of the spear when it comes to driving that and demanding it and talking to the executives about, okay, here's the information you need to request. Here's how you can get it. Here's some of the consultants or nonprofit organizations that can help you implement this across your supply chain so they can actually make it happen. but in a way, it's almost surprising, like the degree to which transparency revolutions are possible. And it's, we're working on some of the outliers to get them to actually step up and do it themselves.
So can we go back to the K-pop folks helping you out? Is that normal to apply? Because I know K-pop obviously Hyundai is huge in South Korea. It's where they're based out of, and K-pop also huge. How do you reach out to those folks and be like, hey, did you know this is happening? Like, what's the process there?
So Mighty Earth has done a lot of work in Korea over many years. We have a lot of great allies there. But this group of K-pop for the planet, I think they work on a bunch of climate issues, nature issues, and they came together to be available. And I think we talked to them about the fact that, hey, this is a significant issue. Hyundai has this outsized role. They're, thankfully investing more in EVs. They're making some great cars, but unfortunately, they are more involved in doing business with some bad suppliers than other companies. And it's an opportunity to drive change and use your presence in Korea, your fame there, to drive a very concrete impact that it could actually have a global impact. So I think that was appealing to them, the fact that we laid out, hey, it's not just, one of many zillion things that companies don't do perfectly, but actually there's a real opportunity here to make a significant difference on this very compelling issue to move from coal to clean energy, stop human rights abuses. And they were enthusiastic about it. And I think the fact that they brought attention to it, made Hyundai stand up. I also think what we did in the United States made them pay attention because the US is such an important market for them. And again, for many of the Asian companies, the US, Europe are their emerging markets. And so we try to build that kind of perfect storm of pressure. We also work with investors to talk to them about it. Investors who say, sending lots of pollution into the atmosphere is a long-term risk for your market share. And I think all things being equal, these companies want to be seen as clean and ethical actors for their customers.
Sure. And Vasily, is Earthworks working on anything in this regard when it comes to extraction or when it comes to just indigenous folks as a rule, like using, I guess, celebrity to put pressure on companies? Is Earthworks or any of the other organizations that you work with doing that?
No, we haven't used that strategy, but I think from the way Glenn describes it, it's an incredibly compelling strategy. Maybe also just to go back a bit to what you mentioned about what is the carrot and what is the stick when it comes to automakers' improvements, and I think Glenn definitely touched on this. But what we're also seeing when it comes to battery minerals and transition minerals, so similar to what Glenn mentioned, you've got Asian companies, East Asian companies wanting to enter into the EU, and because they're trying to increase their presence and their sales in the EU, they've sort of faced the stick, which is like EU legislation. So, for example, the EU battery regs and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. We've seen those types of EU legislation that make it mandatory for large consumers of transition minerals, need to ensure that they also recycle a certain percentage of those minerals, incentivize East Asian automakers that are wanting to enter that market to make sure that they comply with the human rights standards related to transition minerals and also the recycling standards related to transition minerals. And so we've seen that sort of act as a stick when it comes to East Asian automakers entering the EU market. And yeah, like Ben mentioned, in an ideal world, what we would have is mandatory human rights due diligence. You would have a law that applies to all automakers, regardless of where they are in the world, and that ensures that as OEMs, they take responsibility for their supply chains and that they're actually doing due diligence, so that whether you are entering the EU as an automaker or you want to enter an African country as an automaker, you don't have different standards for operating in different ways. And so that's some of the, for example, splits that we are seeing that has moved some automakers, particularly East Asian automakers, with further.
That kind of brings up, I mentioned that, we would rather these companies come in line under market pressures. But is there any recent policy or regulatory changes? And I'll ask this of Vasily first. Is there any recent policy or basically new laws or guidelines that affect supply chains or clean energy incentives that you would like to highlight? Because the organizations are global.
Yes, I can maybe just add a bit more about this EV battery legislation. So this was passed in 2022. And so what the law requires is that battery makers recover 90% of used nickel and cobalt and 50% of used lithium by 2027. So already a lot of these big battery purchasers are thinking towards 2027 and the amount of battery minerals that they will need to acquire from the supply chain so that they're not just mining these minerals endlessly, that they're also having to think about the recovery rates. And also by 2031, the EU battery legislation requires that these recovery rates rise to 95% for used nickel and cobalt and 80% for used lithium. So I think that's one new law that has passed in the EU that we have seen sort of drive a lot of movement. I mean, things have changed right now in the EU with the changing in how the with the change in like the political climate in the EU, there might be a watering down of some of these legislations. But our hope as civil society is that this type of legislation remains strong and that even more is passed to sort of drive change.
And how about in the steel and aluminum space there, Glenn?
So a lot of the safeguards may not come explicitly through environmental protections, but there are some environmental and human rights protections included in a variety of trade agreements that the United States and other countries have entered into. And so, one of the issues that we work on is nickel that goes into batteries. And also it actually goes into stainless steel that is used in automobiles as well. It's nickel has caused a lot of deforestation in countries like Indonesia. And the refining of nickel is currently huge amounts of coal are being used to drive that. And because of that, Indonesia is one of the very few countries that's actually increasing its use of coal so it can drive nickel refining. And that has been an obstacle to their getting access or preferential access to U.S. markets because of the climate, because of the human rights issues involved in that. There's a lot of like land grabbing. And, we saw this terrible video of one of the big nickel companies invading a uncontacted tribe in the island of Sulawesi's land. And this member of the tribe, seemingly trying to resist and then running away. And these mining and extractive projects can cause huge negative impacts on the frontier far away. There are within variety of trade agreements that the United States and other countries have entered into policies that at least don't provide preferential treatment under that. So we've worked with different governments around the world to talk about some of these issues and make sure that they're paying attention to them as they enforce their trade policies.
Yeah, I know. I just looked it up here. In 2020, I wanted to get the date right. Some indigenous people in the Arctic part of Russia, they actually reached out to Elon Musk because a nickel miner was just basically, laying waste to the land that they called home. And so I know that this happens all too often all across the globe. I would hope that some of this stuff, when in terms of, I guess, environmental protections and that kind of thing, it also kind of like hopefully like standard labor practices of making sure your people aren't exposed to carcinogens, and if they are, they have the right safety equipment. I'm hoping that we're not using child labor. Some of those practices, like you said, in the agreements and that we have, trade agreements that we have with other folks, that kind of also helps I don't know. It sounds very cold and callous. So I'm trying not to sound cold and callous. Hopefully that helps lift everything else up. If there's laws on unsafe working conditions, hopefully that means they can't use a certain way that they're going to treat the metals or they're going to mine the batteries and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly our hope too. So I want to say two things. One, we should keep in mind we see very similar, in some cases even worse impacts from oil drilling. So the extent that you can drive electric vehicle adoption, it is helpful in terms of not only avoiding the climate pollution that oil causes, but also some of the devastation of wildlife habitat, pollution of local communities. At the same time, things like nickel in particular, and sometimes cobalt, other minerals that go into making steel, aluminum, coal mining, they're ugly. And, I mentioned the impact we saw in Sulawesi, in the Arctic, here at home in the United States. You also see sometimes these impacts of pollution. And we need to mitigate that. I think one of the frustrating things for us is there are ways that you can dramatically mitigate it. So we've been meeting with a lot of the big mining companies and the auto companies to say, all right, right now, the battery technology you're using involves nickel. And we know that that's caused hundreds of thousands of acres of deforestation. I mean, I've flown over these areas in Indonesia, and what was once tropical rainforest teeming with orangutans is just replaced with this lifeless tailings piles. And it pollutes the water, and people can't drink it, and the kids get poisoned, and it's really ugly. But we've mapped out and shared this with the auto companies, lands that don't have forests on them because they were previously degraded, some of the areas that are most sensitive to water. So we're trying to channel development onto those areas. Similarly, I do think that there are new battery technologies coming online that have a significantly lower environmental impact than nickel. So we need to encourage adoption of those. But I also would say that the mining companies historically are just kind of reckless and just go, wherever they think the metal is without paying much attention to, how it affects the community and whether the indigenous people there care. So in lithium in Nevada, like they just tried to, say, okay, we're going to take this land, we're going to mine it. There's indigenous groups involved there. We need to, U.S. lithium and other minerals is needed to drive the electric vehicle transition. But I would say like a little more sensitivity, a little more listening to the communities about what they want would go a long way. And I think in some cases you'd find that in places where there's relatively low ecological impact, like potentially Nevada, there could be a more open-minded and cooperative way to get these minerals at scale so we can drive the EV transition and the broader clean energy transition without egregious cost. And this is, it's a thorny issue in the sense that there are trade-offs. Like shifting to EVs causes some impact. It reduces the impact of oil, which is even bigger. But like a little sensitivity and openness. And that's what we're trying to push the mining companies, the auto companies to do.
Yeah, I think sensitivity goes a long way. Vasily, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I mean, just adding to what Glenn mentioned, him highlighting the amount of mitigation measures, I think is crucial. But I think also, in addition to those conversations, we also need to be having a discussion about circular economy or like reducing the amount of minerals that need to be mined. And Glenn spoke about, nickel mining that is causing a lot of deforestation. And we also see this with a range of the transition minerals that are mined, that they have huge impact. And so we can have a conversation about mitigation, which is important, but we also need to have a discussion about how can we reduce car dependence on the transportation system. So how do we make sure that we have EVs and we don't want a one-to-one switch from internal combustion engines to EVs. I think an ideal situation would be EVs and public transit system that a lot of working class and poor people can actually afford. That is also I think responsible. I mean, another point that I'd also like to think about is just in terms of the United States specifically, there is a huge car dependency in the US. And I think that is also driving a lot of this requirement for transition minerals. So if the transportation system through policy, through spending shifts, could also reduce car dependency, I think that would also aid in requiring less mining, less minerals, so we could transit, so we could have more equity, more respect for Indigenous people's rights, and more global justice. So I think thinking about a circular economy, thinking about how in certain places we cannot mine because Indigenous peoples live there, but in other places we can mine, as Glenn highlighted. Once we have mines, once we have those minerals in the marketplace, how do we ensure we're increasing the recovery rates so that those minerals are being recycled? Can automakers ensure that at the end of life of a battery that is in their EVs, they're able to use it for other purposes or recover those minerals so that they can produce other products. So I think thinking more holistically about how we can move away from mining as much, I think is really important just in terms of like policy and just ensuring that we have more justice in these issues.
Yeah, we're in a weird spot right now where we potentially have a lot of these rare earth minerals and the key minerals that go into the battery packs and things like that. We could potentially recycle them, but the batteries are lasting longer than we thought they would. So that leads us, at least for now, until either some changes on the way we own vehicles changes in the U.S. for sure, changes on the way we have public transportation. The option going forward is to get the minerals out of the ground. I would imagine in 5-6 years when we start really recycling the batteries of those earlier EVs, that's going to help on the impact. Does that sound right, or are we going to still see the same amount of mining that we're seeing now?
I think so. Some of the pushback that we receive as Earthworks and just other organizations in this space is the question about, let's say not having enough transition minerals feedstock in the marketplace to begin these conversations regarding a circular economy. But our point is, you can't build out a circular economy. You can't think about recovering 10 years from now, 15 years from now, once these EVs have reached their end of life. This is something that needs to be built out now. The infrastructure needs to be built out now, and funding for recovering needs to be thought about now. And so I agree with you that depending on the type of mineral, there might not be enough, let's say, in the marketplace, because a lot of these transition minerals might not have been required in previous technologies. I know aluminium, steel has always been in automakers, but a lot of these battery minerals have not been required in the quantities that they are right now. But we still need to be thinking about the type of infrastructure that needs to be built to support automakers taking responsibility for their EVs and being able to recover when those car companies do reach their end.
And do you have anything to add on that, Glenn?
Well, I think that's all right, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of transit as an option. It moves more people more efficiently, more cleanly. But we do live in a car dependent society, and a lot of other countries are too. And I think the reality is what we need to happen for the climate is to have rapidly accelerating EV adoption. I'm concerned about the potential for the rollback of the EV tax credits, or as you talked about in your podcast last week, the federal government now looking to rip out or decommission 8,000 vehicle chargers that they've already installed. And so I want to scale the EV transition as fast as possible, also invest in transit 100%. To do that, we need minerals. I think we do need to look at technologies that can reduce the requirements for minerals, like better battery technologies. And so I also look at how can we mine in a more responsible way. I don't think it costs that much, or in fact, we see often when they pay a little more attention, they can drive better profitability, and that's what we're trying to communicate. But we need to scale up mineral availability, but we need it to do it without using more coal or causing more human rights abuse.
Okay, so I got one more question for you, and then I'll get you out of here. If you had access to all 18 CEOs on this list, and they were going to listen to one thing you had to say, and they were going to actually do it, and I'll start with Vasily. What one piece of advice would you tell them to do for 2025?
I would say make explicit commitments to respect the rights of Indigenous peoples and ensure that you implement the correct due diligence processes to make sure that you are preventing, mitigating, and accounting for the violations of Indigenous peoples in the supply chain.
And how about you, Glenn?
Well, for 2025, I think I would say make a strong commitment to zero carbon sourcing for 100% of your steel and aluminum for every year going forward to 2040. I would also add that given some of the overall attacks in the United States, especially on electric vehicle adoption, given the enormous benefits that has to climate and environment, they should redouble their commitments to EV adoption and be loudly advocating with government to keep those incentives so that the United States can continue to compete in what I think is the great race of the 21st century, which is decarbonization. I was reading about how some of these Chinese auto companies took the lead in producing auto companies and why they're getting such great access in European markets and elsewhere right now, other Asian markets. And it was because they worked together with government, taxi fleets, taxi drivers, individual drivers, truck fleets in a sort of somewhat coordinated way. And that, it's scary as an American to think that we are not even trying to compete now. We're going in the opposite direction. And seemingly the government is driving a return to fossil fuels, to oil. And with all of its attendant consequences, and the rest of the country is leaping ahead, obviously that has negative impacts for the environment, but also just like on a basic competitiveness level, it's troubling. And so I hope that one of the things we've seen is that no matter, even when government's not doing its job, the job still has to get done. The private sector is often best positioned to drive the changes that we need. And I hope that they can stand up and say, look, we need at least a basic infrastructure of support so we can continue to build out the EVs, so we can compete as a country, that we can protect our climate, that we can not have our forests incinerated and people lose their homes. And so that I think in the very immediate future is my big ask.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for coming on and sharing with us. Obviously, people can go to leadthecharge.com or .org, leadthecharge.org to look at the leaderboard, and you can read the documents, and you can even one of the neat things about the website is you can see the methodology and how they put this all together. So I know we have a lot of engineers, we have some scientists, we have folks out there who really like to dig into this stuff, and you can look at it from a very high level, which is the graphs and things like that, and then you can go real deep. So go to leadthecharge.org, and then Vasily, how would people find out what Earthworks is doing and what you're up to?
Yes, so Earthworks is part of a coalition called Securing Indigenous Rights in the Green Economy. And if your listeners are interested in seeing some of Surge's statements related to this leaderboard and what our recommendations are, they can check out surgecoalition.org. And you can also check out Earthworks' Making Clean Energy Clean campaign, just to get a sense of the work that we do, the engagements we have with automakers, for the support that we also provide communities and frontline communities. And that is at earthworks.org.
And how about you, Glenn?
Yeah, we're at mightyearth.org and welcome people's input on the scorecard and our other work. And if people want to reach out to me, I post on LinkedIn. My name is Glenn Hurowitz, and you can find me there. And welcome hearing from people about how they can get involved or any other questions they have.
Excellent. Thank you both for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Great podcast. Love it.
Oh, thank you. All right, I want to thank Vasile Nubey and Glenn Hurowitz for coming on and being so generous with their time. I thought it was a really good interview, and they both have an open invitation to come on the show whenever they want. I also want to thank William for facilitating this interview. I've worked with William a few times now, and he is always very professional, and he makes things super easy on me. So thank you, William, for setting this all up. All right, everybody, that is it for me on this episode. Next week, we are going to hear from Bart Bouchatz. And if you remember right, Bart's come on several times over the last different vehicles that he tested on his journey to find a new car. One of my favorite things, like I always love having Bart on. Bart's a great guest, good friend, love Bart. But one of the things that I get the most amount of joy of is Bart lives in this cool little community in Ireland, and I get to watch in some cases, not in every case, but depending on the year, but I get to watch the sun go down because Ireland's like 8 or 9 hours ahead of us. So when we do these interviews, it starts off in the sun, and then the next thing you know, it's now dark, and I get to see that sunset in Ireland. So it's kind of a cool thing for me. Just behind the scenes there. Again, thank you to Vasily, thank you to Glenn, and thank you to William for coming on and being so generous with their time. Make sure to go and check out mightyearth.org, earthworks.org, and leadthecharge.org, and I'll make sure to put links in the show notes. Thanks for hanging out, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.